All right, welcome back to the FITSNews studio, another edition of your Week in Review. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for liking and subscribing us as well. A big week for us to cover this week. The eyes of America on Beaufort County, South Carolina, as Alec Murdaugh was sentenced for the financial crimes that he pleaded guilty to earlier this month. Also in Beaufort County, we've got an update on that, but also more importantly, two big narratives in the ongoing Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga: the search for Murdaugh's missing millions, as well as the latest developments in the investigation into Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill. Will the jury tampering allegations against Hill give Murdaugh a new trial? I'm going to walk you through the very latest on that story. I've also got an update from First in the South, South Carolina, and the presidential primary election that's just around the corner. Former Governor Nikki has some huge momentum. We're going to walk you through the big endorsement that she got this past week and why it could position her to be more competitive against Donald Trump in this pivotal early voting state. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. All right, so we're starting off this week again with the Murdaughs, or the Murdaugh spinoff, as our resident Murdaugh expert and research director Jen Wood referred to it last week, the case of Becky Hill, the clerk of court in Colleton County, who's alleged jury tampering. And of course, it's very important to point out this is still alleged, is the focus of Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. But before we get to that, and we've got a lot to cover on that, I want to briefly go over what most of the media were focused on this week, Jen, which was the big sentencing hearing for Alec Murdaugh down in Beaufort County on the financial crimes that he pleaded guilty to back on November 17th. Jen, were there any surprises? You were anchoring that for us on our live stream. Did you have any surprises from that hearing? What were some observations from what
There
you saw there in
weren't
Beaufort?
there weren't necessarily any surprises coming out of the hearing. I think, we all knew from when he pled guilty that they had agreed on a 27-year sentence, of which he'd have to serve 85%. So going into it, there were no surprises. We expected to hear from victims as they addressed the court, and Alex spoke on his own behalf, which shouldn't surprise anybody who's followed this case because he likes to hear himself speak. And you know what? His attorneys, Dick and Jim, said would be a 5 to 10 minute statement ended up being a 50-minute, very long diatribe. So it was, I think that probably was the most surprising part. But
Just the fact he went on that long.
yeah, whew, that he was allowed to go on that long.
Yeah, it was an interesting vibe. The obviously we were down there for the plea deal, which I think really surprised a lot of folks. Particularly if you go back, we talked about this during our live stream, how the state did not come off of its life without parole uh, baseline until that final week, and I think it was just the potential cost to taxpayers there in Beaufort that really pushed them to cut a deal with Murdaugh. But Jen, you and I know the real news this week really wasn't the uh, the hearing down in Beaufort. We all kind of expected what was going to happen there. Murdaugh's soliloquy certainly a little bit of a wrinkle there, but the real news this week is moving on two different fronts, and I want to start on the first front, the Murdaugh money. Obviously, we are seeing a lot of motion on this. Most folks had just assumed that the people who have the most interest in finding this money, whether it's the court appointed receivers who are charged with collecting as many of those Murdaugh assets as possible to make them available for victims, or whether it's Murdaugh's former law partners. Most folks had assumed that everyone had pretty much just given up trying to find this money, but we got news this past week that that's not the case, that the hunt for the missing Murdaugh millions are still very much the hunt is still very much underway. And Jen, it's starting to venture into some areas where you have some experience, at least in research, not practical experience, but the money laundering, the offshore banks. Give us a little bit of a breakdown on kind of where this money may be.
So from my understanding, his former law firm has hired people to help track the money down, which I think is interesting. One, they don't know where it's at. Two, that they're investing that kind of money to look for money. But yeah, the theory is that just prior to the murders and after, Alex had been taking trips to the Bahamas on, I believe, private jets. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. And in fact, we've got trips leading up to the murders and
Hmm.
apparently even some trips after
Right.
the double homicide. We've got trips, as you mentioned, to the Bahamas, at least one trip to Colombia in South America. So a lot of these trips, folks are starting to wait a minute, what exactly was he doing down there? And some family sources have indicated, well, a few of those were for family vacations and to celebrate, Buster Murdoch. But we're starting to look at some of these trips now with potentially a different motivation. Isn't that right, Jen?
Right. You know, place to go when you want to launder money through shell account, shell companies' accounts is the Bahamas. I mean, and if he was if he was looking at his money being scrutinized, that is where, and Mark Tinsley was getting closer to getting access to his accounts.
Mm.
That's what I would do.
Well,
Unless
you got the Bahamas,
right.
you've got Grand Cayman. In fact, there's a Bank of China branch in Grand Cayman that has attracted a lot of scrutiny because, a lot of these smaller countries in the Caribbean, if the federal government comes knocking, they'll give over those assets. They'll play ball with the feds, but the Bank of China,
Mhm.
not so inclined. So some have speculated that perhaps, he takes those traditional steps of forming those shell corporations and then putting the money into perhaps a place like the Bank of China branch there in the Grand Cayman. But Jen, the thing I found most interesting about this renewed hunt for these missing millions was one of the quotes that we got from one of the sources that's very closely tied to that effort, who said that Murdoch's not as dumb as everyone seems to think he is. And I thought that was very interesting because, there's always been this discussion from the beginning, is this guy just an incredibly stupid criminal or is he a smarter criminal than we think? What based on all this new information, Jim, what's your assessment of that question?
I have always thought he is smarter than people give him credit for.
Really? Tell
I just
why do you think that?
I've heard rumors, through connected sources in the Low Country that they he was laundering the money overseas. And I mean that was always kind of just a given. So, it surprised me that, nobody was looking that way. I've been digging in offshore account leaks for 2 years now, looking to see if I could find anything that tied back to Alex. I've been unsuccessful, but, to me, I think, yeah, I think is a lot more that was going on outside of just the murders and him taking money from clients, stealing money from clients.
When also, in addition to your extensive research on money laundering and its potential applications to the Murdoch saga, Jen, who can forget back in the fall of 2021, you were the first one linking a lot of Murdoch's relationships, whether it was to Barrett Bowler, linking a lot of those relationships to some properties, common properties that had some interesting drug smuggling
Which
connections.
everybody
Can't for,
seems to have forgotten about. I mean, it's just like it never
Mhm.
happened. And I'm not going to get into the jellyfish thing too much because that is a whole thing. But the jellyfish operation that Barrett Buller was tied to before he died is linked to Chinese nationals. So yeah, I mean, there are some very interesting connections that I don't think anybody has explored that I think indicate that there was a much bigger web of corruption and crime going on than anybody will admit.
No, I think you're right. I think the two biggest threads left to pull on the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. Number one is these money laundering, potential drug smuggling connections, and then number two, the judges who have yet to be held accountable for at the very least criminal negligence in overseeing some of these settlements. But let's talk a little bit, Jen. We're looking at these the potential location of the money and the search for the money. And we talked about this in our article, and you and I have talked about this also. Let me ask you this very fundamental question. If Alec Murdoch had millions of dollars that he's trying to get out of the country into shell companies, into offshore accounts, why is he so hard up for cash in the final months leading up to those murders? It just, to me, why is he taking out the loans? Why is he getting the lines of credit and immediately exhausting the lines of credit? from Palmetto State Bank. What,
because he
I
had
mean,
moved
don't you
all
feel
his
there's a,
liquid assets.
okay,
I mean,
fair
if you
enough.
get rid of what you have and you don't have money coming in, you are gonna need loans. You are gonna need help.
Mhm.
I mean,
Well, we,
who knows if any of who knows? But I do think the trips to the Bahamas are very, very suspicious. I'm glad somebody is finally looking into that angle. But yeah, I mean, if he was busy moving his finances away to where Mark Tinsley couldn't get at it for the boat crash lawsuit, then yeah, he may have started to
do
feel
you think
feel
there's
pinch.
money? Do you think that Murdoch has money stashed away in offshore accounts? Yes or no?
Yes.
You do. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I would have said maybe prior to this week. This week, I'm very much leaning
Oh yeah.
toward that. Yes. So obviously, keep it tuned to FITSNews.com. We had a big report up earlier this week on those Murdoch missing millions. You can read it all on FITSNews.com. But we will absolutely continue our investigation into the search for that money, not only tracking other folks that are searching it, but Jen, are you up for a trip down to the Bahamas or Grand Cayman?
Always.
I mean,
Always.
hey,
Let's go.
we could we could expense that, right? Yeah. I'll
You got to ask the
I'll ask my
CEO.
oh, yeah, I'll ask my CEO slash wife about that. I think that's going to be a resounding no. But either way, count on us to keep our folks up to speed on the very latest on the missing millions. But Jen, let's shift gears now. The real big news this week, breaking late on Friday, and we'd hinted at it earlier in the week, but we got more details as the week wore on. We're going to talk about the implications of this news in a minute, but first, let's just break down the big news. We have gone inside the escalation of the investigation into Becky Hill, the clerk of court down in Colleton County, getting a lot of new details about where this investigation is headed, and again, what that might mean for Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. Jen, we got very close to Becky Hill during the 6 week trial down there in Walterboro, South Carolina. Uh, very close to Becky. Let me ask you this. Everything that's coming out now that we're hearing now, I mean, even last week we talked about it on this show. You know, I'm struggling to accept some of these allegations as fact. I'm struggling to accept that there could be some credibility to these jury tampering allegations. Where are you right now on the bottom line related to these allegations against Becky Hill?
I think you know that I have always struggled to accept that any of these allegations could be true. I've always leaned towards if there was any validity to them that it wasn't intentional on Becky's part. But the more information that comes out and the more that there are allegations of her trying to hide things, the more concerned I get about, about the jury tampering part of things.
Yeah, let's just walk our audience through a few of those. The big report that we filed just yesterday on Friday related to the allegations against Becky Hill. For the first time, we have a copy of one of the two ethics reports or complaints, rather, submitted against Becky Hill. That this was sent to the South Carolina State Ethics Commission. This is one of the two complaints. We do not have a copy of the second complaint. The first one you can read for yourself on fitsnews.com. It deals with allegations of misusing taxpayer resources in an effort to facilitate the writing of her book, Behind the Doors of Justice. It alleges that Hill essentially took advantage of her official position of the courthouse property of taxpayer resources to facilitate the publication of that book. Uh, Jen, you've read that complaint. Any merit to it in your estimation?
I think there's a lot of merit to it because a lot of it is, like her holding book signings at the courthouse and doing tours of the courthouse and an image of Alex in his holding cell during the trial appearing in connection with her book on Facebook. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of merit to it because a lot of it's true and we know it's true.
Let me ask you now a little bit about So the first complaint zeroes in on the book and essentially accuses her of, again, misusing, misappropriating resources to facilitate the book, and including photographs taken by Melissa Gordon. Is that the name? The
Yeah,
photographer,
Melissa
or
Gordon.
her husband Neil Gordon, the co-author of Behind the
Right.
Doors of Justice. So some of those pictures have been raised, and it was interesting. The person who filed this first complaint noted specifically that they were concerned that the disclosures would impact the ability of the conviction to survive an appeal. Very interesting that that was already something that individual was focused on way back when this was filed in the summer. Let's turn now though to the second complaint. Again, we do not have a copy of it. And as we noted in the report, which we filed again yesterday on FITSNews.com, I didn't get into speculation about specific alleged misappropriations, but the theme of this complaint from the sources we spoke with are that there are seven different, I guess, funding streams, you want to call them, two of them federal funding streams from the Department of Health and Human Services, child support related incentive funding. Uh, all of these seven different funding streams, records have been subpoenaed by ethics investigators. And not only that, this is the part that I found most ominous, potentially anyway, for Becky Hill. Her personal financial records have also been subpoenaed. So we've got her personal financial records, Jen, subpoenaed in connection with that investigation, and then her cell phone, obviously subpoenaed in connection with the investigation into her son, Colt Hill. And by the way, we're hearing more and more that that entire eavesdropping charge, criminal charge against her son, Jeffrey Colt Hill, relates to efforts to keep Becky abreast of these ethics inquiries. It's just a tangled web again. Here we go, right?
Right. I don't think when Alex said that in court, he had any clue how prophetic it was gonna be. I mean, it just keeps coming up. Yeah, and the fund investigations are definitely concerning. And why people always ask, well, why does that matter when it, relates to the jury tampering? It matters because her the jury tampering deals with her credibility. And her credibility, if they do take those allegations in front of a judge for an evidentiary hearing, she is going to be testifying, and her credibility matters. And,
Mm.
if any of these things do pan out, if there are criminal charges filed against her, her credibility is just going to be shot. It's
Well,
scary.
let's shift the gears a bit because this is the real question. I mean, obviously, there folks in Colleton County are very concerned about, the integrity of the local government down there, and certainly it's a if you live in Walterboro, South Carolina, and you have to rely on the administration of county government, the county court, you want to make sure everything's on the up and up. But for the national, international audience tracking the Murdaugh case, obviously their primary concern here is Alec Murdaugh going to get a new trial, and if so, on what basis? And looking at these complaints against Becky Hill, let's talk a little bit now about the latest we're hearing on the jury tampering allegations. One of the big things that came to light this week, and we were talking about it, this notion that something changed around about February 15th or 16th. I can't remember the exact date. It was the date that the foreman of the jury was replaced. If you recall, if you watched the trial, the jurors themselves chose a foreman, an individual who we are told was very vigorous in asserting, uh, that everyone adhered to their oath, that they very strictly follow uh, the judge's orders as it related to their not deliberating on the case, not discussing the case prior to the end of the trial. But as you recall, Judge Newman uh, installed his own foreperson later, and we are informed that that was a key moment in this trial, and that there may be some questions regarding contact between that new foreperson and Clerk Hill. Is that what you're hearing as well, Jen?
Yeah, I've heard the exact same thing. And, it's just, it sounded like, of all of the jurors, Becky Hill had a particularly close relationship with this foreperson, friendly almost. and had been,
Mhm.
there's evidence of them going into closed rooms and talking together alone, um, that will be brought up in an evidentiary hearing. And yes, definitely, it's a problem. It's a problem.
And again, we spoke in one of our previous broadcasts about the business cards, which were reportedly either laid out on a table or we don't know exactly how they were routed to the jurors, but some are hinting that this was a clear motivation, national attention in exchange for a guilty verdict. And so that's one that we're going to have to continue to dive into the notion that promises of media fame, potentially fortune. I've heard some Broadway shows are involved. Who knows? Uh, but we'll dig into that as this continues to unfold. But looking at how this impacts the new trial, uh, and again, I think I just may have hinted at where this might be going. The bid for a new trial. We are starting to hear rumblings, Jen, that the new trial is something both the state and the defense, to say nothing of the Supreme Court, are now they're all but assured that this is happening. And in fact, we're hearing that the Chief Justice, as he prepares a list of judges to handle the upcoming evidentiary hearing, is not just looking at a judge to handle that one hearing, but is going to pick someone who is going to handle the whole process as it moves forward, including a new trial.
I'm hearing the same thing. I'm hearing also that they're looking at venues, and obviously they're not agreeing already. So I mean they're
Well,
already
tell us
well
what you've heard, Jen, on the venues, because this is very interesting too.
yeah, so I've heard that the state, the AG's office is they would like for the trial to be moved to Clarendon or Sumter. And the defense would like the venue to be Ori or Charleston. Interesting.
Interesting.
Hmm.
So they feel that the defense thinks they've got a better chance in those areas. I wonder, it would seem to me that the news would be more saturated in those bigger counties, Jen.
Well, yeah, I thought that was an interesting two counties. I thought those were interesting choices. Then I thought about Ori, and I was like, well, that is kind of far up in the corner of the state. They clearly have the infrastructure to handle the influx that would come with a trial this public. That made sense. I Charleston, I'm not sure Charleston makes sense to me because I think they need to keep it out of the low country, personally.
Hmm.
I don't know. But
Just too
when
close
I
to that Murdoch sphere
right,
of
it's
influence.
just too tied. I mean, everything down there is tied together. I mean, it is a tangled web. But then I remembered I was talking to Mandy Powers Norell in our interview earlier this fall, and she said, anytime that you do a change of venue, you're seeking to have the venue, the county that it gets moved to, similar demographically to the county from which it came. So, she said they're gonna want to pick a county similar to Colleton County.
Most of the speculation I've heard is very much in line with what you're thinking. We are hearing Sumter County
Yeah,
could be where this thing ends up, just as a place that kind of meets that similar demographic composition of the jury pool, but also a facility that could handle the
right.
influx of a second trial. Gosh, can you imagine having to do this again? My goodness,
No,
my goodness. Well, Jen Wood, our resident Murdoch expert, you have been central to each of the big stories that broke on FITSNews.com over the past week as we have again seen this story, which again, every time we think it's over, every time we think that we're closing a chapter, as we saw in Beaufort this week, a new door seems to open, a new Pandora's box, a new rabbit hole. It's just a story that, again, the resolution is elusive, isn't it?
it it appears to be very elusive.
Jen, predictions from you on Becky Hill. Let's bottom line this. Do you believe that she will be criminally indicted in connection with some of these allegations that are flowing up from the ethics reports?
I think if what we're hearing from sources is correct, I expect to see some indictments, unfortunately,
Wow.
which is heartbreaking.
Wow.
What about you?
And obviously, uh, it's sad to say, yes, if the
Yeah.
allegations contained in those documents are true, and particularly we're looking at federal funds in one of these things, which is a whole new ball game when it comes to allegations of misappropriation when federal funds get involved. So yes, if those allegations are accurate, then I agree. And now I think that leads to our next question, Jen. Does Alec Murdaugh get a new trial? Where are you on that? Give me a percentage. Yes or no?
I'm like, he's getting a new trial. That to me, it's
100.
inevitable at this point. Oh yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I
I've
absolutely.
always been lower than you.
Hmm.
I've always been a little lower than you, but I pushing 80, certainly
Yeah,
from my perspective at this point. Pushing
yeah.
80%. Jim Wood, can't thank you enough. Your work on this story from the very beginning. We were talking about it earlier in this segment, going all the way back to those first reports we did together back in the fall of 2021. You have been so integral to what we're doing. Can't thank you enough and look forward to covering the next developments in this story with you as we learn more about whether or not Alec Murdaugh will indeed get that new trial. Jen Wood, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So, the closer we get to the end of the year, the closer we get to crunch time in the Republican presidential primary election, which, if you've been following this race for some time, it was supposed to be over, may still be over. Former U.S. President Donald Trump with a huge lead nationally and also a huge lead still in all of the key early voting states. But the candidate on the move, at least on the GOP side, Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, former ambassador to the United Nations under Donald Trump. Haley has seen, she calls it a surge. Let's go ahead and give credit where it's due. It's a surge. Haley has overtaken Florida Governor Ron DeSantis as the number 2 GOP challenger in this race behind Trump. And as this race moves forward, things are setting up very nicely for the former South Carolina governor. I want to walk you through a little bit of that calculus. If you watch just the national polls, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, DeSantis is still a little bit ahead of Haley. She's not even really at just about 10%, struggling to stay above double digits. And that's true. But if you go to the early voting states, this is where the dominoes start to fall, where momentum is built over those pivotal first months of the coming year. And that is where Haley is picking up tremendous ground. Let's go to Iowa. First, in Iowa, Haley is caught up with Ron DeSantis. They are neck and neck within the margin of error on both Real Clear Politics and 538's polling averages. So that's a huge situation there because if Haley is able to continue to move past DeSantis in Iowa, that is really big for her momentum heading into New Hampshire, where she has already passed DeSantis, where she is, in fact, moving well ahead of DeSantis, who's actually been passed by Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey. He's in 4th place up there in the Granite State. So if Haley's able to beat DeSantis in Iowa, take that momentum to New Hampshire, where she's already ahead of him, South Carolina then becomes high noon because, folks, in South Carolina, Haley is on the move, past DeSantis also in this pivotal early voting state, and is well positioned to potentially, I say potentially because you never know what's going to happen in these things, potentially put up a fight against Trump in that pivotal Palmetto State battleground. I wanted to pull something out here because we talked about, what the hell happened to DeSantis. This was a guy who, heading out of the November elections, had just crushed it in Florida. This was a guy barely won his first election, but was reelected in a landslide. He was the golden child of the Never Trump uh, conservative, the wing of the party that liked Trump policies but was a little leery of Trump's electability. He was the guy everyone thought was going to seize that mantle, and he was polling within single digits of Trump at one point in the aftermath of those November 2022 elections when, by the way, Trump was getting blamed by everybody for putting forward bad candidates and costing Republicans their shot at a big majority in the House of Representatives. So as we looked at those races, as we looked at where DeSantis was at that time, I drew something many, many months ago, and it sort of previewed what was going to happen to DeSantis. And I want to pull this up here. Jotted that out real technological there, but it shows DeSantis, his candidacy, and the various forces that were going to be brought to bear against it. And you can see up here we've got Trump, we've got the media, we've got Democrats, we've got that second tier of candidates. And I put the question to pretty much everybody at the time, how does he survive with all these different forces come at him from all these different directions? Well, we now know the answer, which is he didn't. The DeSantis campaign has literally collapsed. He is polling at levels 1/4 of where he was originally in some states, just a free fall that has been a steady, months long decline in support for his candidacy. Now, is he out? Again, never say never in this process. Anything can happen in politics. Momentum is a fickle mistress, but by all accounts, the once promising DeSantis candidacy has seen its money dry up, its momentum fade, and his polling position drop accordingly. So obviously, DeSantis' loss has been Nikki Haley's gain. And if you pull that chart back up real quick, there's a few things there that Nikki Haley doesn't have to worry. Obviously, the media loves her. Trump has been fairly soft on her. Second tier candidates, well, guess what, folks? The second tier in the Republican primary is evaporating. Mike Pence is out of the race. Tim Scott, the U.S. Senator from South Carolina, is out of the race, which, by the way, opened up a huge avenue of support for Haley here in the Palmetto State. So a lot of those factors that a lot of the other candidates would have to deal with, contend with, Haley not getting as much pressure. The press loves her. Media loves her. Democrats love her. In fact, Jamie Dimon, the big banker running J.P. Morgan Chase, the world's biggest bank, even encouraged, quote, very liberal Democrats to donate to Haley's campaign because he believes she is the best option to beat Trump and, according to him, restore the American economy. Now, as Haley begins to move forward in the polls, as all this momentum seems to coalesce around her candidacy, she received a huge endorsement this past week, and it came in the form of Americans for Prosperity, their action group, the AFP Action. It's a political group that works with Americans for Prosperity. They endorsed Haley this week, but we broke down in a very special report on FITSNews.com why this is more than just an endorsement, why it's more than just a pat on the back, a slapping of a label, lending someone their imprimatur. This is a grassroots army. It's data. It's money. It is a huge shot in the arm for Haley at a moment when her campaign was already on the upswing. Now, we spent some time, Dylan Nolan and I, our producer, in the neighborhoods of Columbia, South Carolina, the very heart of early voting, first in the South, Palmetto State. We saw this effort in action. We saw these door-to-door volunteers for AFP Action campaigning literally on behalf of Haley in South Carolina. And this is huge because if you look at where this race was headed, the trajectory of this race, if Haley's going to have any chance against Donald Trump, who, again, at this point, presumptive GOP nominee. In fact, I think it's a 10, 15% chance that anybody can beat him. But it's increasingly looking like that anybody, if it's going to be anybody, will be Nikki Haley because, again, this huge infusion of support, which we saw on the streets of Columbia, South Carolina earlier this week, has her in much better position, again, than any of these other candidates. And at this point, the question is, how long does DeSantis even stay in the race? He had a big high-profile debate this week with the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. Our Mark Powell wrote a big piece on that for FITSNews.com that really sort of criticized both of those candidates for some of the toxic mudslinging that's so prevalent in politics. But as we think about that, and Haley, let's think about how that could unfold in South Carolina. Obviously, if that progression I talked about earlier, Haley wins in Iowa over DeSantis, is potentially competitive against Trump in New Hampshire. Again, that sets South Carolina up for high noon, people. First in the South presidential primary will be the pivotal test for Donald Trump and whether or not he will be able to secure a third consecutive GOP nomination. Again, this media outlet obviously has history with Haley. We may end up having to devote an entire episode to it if her stock continues to climb. We'll certainly do that, not afraid to discuss it. But as I've said all along, we cover all of these candidates based on the issues. We criticize them substantively. We credit them substantively. And in fact, I'm very proud of how this media outlet has handled Haley's campaign, particularly the credit we showed her on the issue of entitlements. Not only is she, amongst Republican candidates anyway, the person who has the best fiscal position on that issue, but she also pressured some of the other candidates, including DeSantis, to get closer to where they needed to be on that issue. And by the way, Trump completely on the wrong end of the entitlement debate. He wants no reform, basically wants to keep kicking the can down the road. So Again, FITSNews has always put those personal histories, all those things aside to report on what's really happening, whether it's these endorsements that we covered this past week, or again, those bigger projections of where this race is moving forward. And again, whether we like it or not, whether those of you who are true conservative voters in the GOP like it or not, Nikki Haley is the candidate on the move in South Carolina and beyond. All right, that's a wrap for this week's edition, our first December show. I want to thank Dylan, Nolan, Jen Wood, our whole team for their help. That reminds me, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe us on YouTube. That helps us get to that next level of support. And as we approach the holidays, please think about, if you read us on FITSNews, if you follow these stories we've been talking about, it's only $8 a month. Please subscribe to FITSNews.com. Again, that enables everything that we do here, helps us hold those in power accountable. We will catch you next time on the Week in Review.